Well, good morning once again, and thank you all for joining us for this Investor Alliance for Human Rights webinar on children's rights in business, tools and guidance for responsible business conduct. My name is Paloma Munoz, for those who don't know me, and I'm the Program Director of the Investor Alliance. Before jumping into the discussion today, I'll just say a few words about the Alliance for those of you who may be less familiar with this ICCR-led initiative. The Investor Alliance was launched in May 2018 and currently has 135 members representing $3 trillion in assets under management. The goal of the Alliance is to provide investors with a platform to first engage with companies to promote respect for human rights, and secondly, to engage with states and standard-setting bodies to advocate for the creation of enabling environments for responsible business conduct. The way we do this is by increasing investor leverage and capacity to identify, assess, and address human rights and business risks in three ways. The first way is through collective action, and this includes actions that respond to urgent situations or significant human rights concerns, such as immigration, detention, and family separation crisis at the US border, or the presence of child laborers in global supply chains. As you may be aware, the Alliance has recently issued a guidance document on corporate human rights due diligence related to immigration, detention, and family separation, as well as a statement on responsible sourcing in the jewelry supply chain. Both of these urge businesses to conduct human rights due diligence to respect children's rights. The other way that we do this is by building the capacity of investors on human rights in business and the framework that establishes the responsibilities of companies with respect to human rights. And therefore, we provide members with relevant standards, guidance, tools, and trainings. This not only helps inform our collective actions, but it also helps investors integrate human rights considerations into their investment decision-making and engagements with companies across different sectors. Lastly, the Alliance connects investors with stakeholders, including NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and international organizations such as UNICEF, as well as with community-based organizations, trade unions, academics, faith groups, and other relevant actors. So, as may be evident, ensuring business respect for children's rights has been a priority for investors of the Alliance, who recognize that businesses can impact directly and indirectly on the lives of children in numerous ways. Therefore, this webinar seeks to raise awareness of the range of adverse impacts companies have on children and share tools and guidance that support responsible business conduct based on respect for children's rights. With that, I would like to invite Tytti Kaasinen, Head of Stewardship and Risk Engagement at GAS, an Alliance member, to get us started.
Great, thank you very much, Paloma. So first of all, if we go back to the speaker slide, and before even that, some housekeeping issues. So this webinar is being recorded and you will also get the slides afterwards. So don't worry about trying to write down something if you see on the slide. You will get them afterwards in an email and they will also be available online. So if you have a colleague who for some reason didn't register for this webinar, they will also have access to the materials afterwards. There will be plenty of time in the end for discussion and questions. So please use the chat box function on your screen or click to raise your hand and we will, in the latter case, then unmute you to ask your questions in the end. But in any case, we warmly encourage questions throughout the webinar. So on your screen now then you will see the speakers for today and we have a great lineup. And everyone will be introducing themselves in more detail as we go on. But as a reminder of what you can expect, we will have Ida Hyllested from UNICEF and Joe Becker from the Human Rights Watch talking to different aspects relating to children's rights based on their respective expertise areas. And Tracey Rembert of CBIS will then add the investor perspective and lead the discussion in the end. So again, please do utilize the chat box if you want to either share your own experiences or ask the experts to elaborate on something. But first, I myself would like to set the scene a little bit by talking about how investors seem to be currently perceiving the issue of children's rights and what challenges there appears to be. So if we go to the next slide. In the interest of time, I will just shortly say to anyone who doesn't know GS that we are a research and engagement provider for institutional investors headquartered in Sweden. And as Paloma mentioned, we are proud alliance members, obviously. And I myself am heading our proactive thematic engagements and have also had children's rights among my responsibilities for many years. So that makes me personally particularly delighted about this webinar and about getting the chance to talk to you all today. So if we move on into GES approach and work on children's rights, there have been both reactive and proactive elements, and we've aimed our efforts towards both investors and companies, which is perhaps natural given our function as a kind of a middleman between the two. For example, over the years, we've engaged with various companies on child labor, just like many of you, I'm sure, as part of our service based on international norms breaches, with some of you perhaps familiar with my colleague Stina Nielsen and her efforts in relation to the cocoa supply chain and child labor there. What we have specifically had an ambition to do as well is to increase investors' awareness of this topic and to inspire them to integrate children's rights beyond child labor in their processes. And some of you perhaps also joined the 3 webinars on different aspects that we held a couple of years ago. And we also offer a proactive engagement project focusing on children's rights in media and marketing. In response to feedback that we've been getting from related investor surveys that we've been carrying out, in 2016 we also issued investor guidelines on children's rights integration to really provide practical hands-on tools for investors to take this issue into account in decision making and in their active ownership activities. And this autumn we are revising those guidelines in cooperation with UNICEF and would very much appreciate your input, but Ida will say a little bit more about this later. I will also be part of the advisory committee developing expectations for the tech sector to combat child exploitation online, a work led by Tracey Rembert of CBIS, who will hopefully elaborate on that later in this webinar. It's a very interesting initiative, I promise you. Going back to the investor surveys that I mentioned, that's something that GS has done in cooperation with the Global Child Forum, a Swedish NGO focusing on children's rights and business. And I thought it would be useful to outline some of our findings by way of framing where the investors are at the moment and what's perhaps therefore needed to advance this issue in the industry. So what we've done is to survey PRI's asset owner signatories 3 times in 2014, 15 and last year, with the view of finding out the level of awareness of children's rights among them and to also establish what are the experiences and challenges that might be hindering further uptake. And later on there's a link coming up in the slide so you can check the findings in more detail if you're interested in looking up later. But basically the findings have been very similar year to year. They show that investors frequently address human rights in their decision making, but the topic of children's rights is not at the top of the agenda, except for the issue of child labor, which is fairly commonly recognized as being pertinent. The engagements described by the respondents are almost exclusively centered around various aspects of child labor as well. For example, in the cocoa sector, cobalt mining, and the garment industry. But in general, most investors responding to our surveys consider children's rights as a subset of human rights rather than a separate area. So there seems to be a lack of awareness among investors and probably companies as well about what children's rights are, why they are relevant, and how companies can be encouraged to support these rights. And in particular, the investors have emphasized that it's hard to pinpoint how companies addressing children's rights relates to financial performance. But still, as you can see on the next slide, the vast majority of the respondents do consider children's rights issues to have a potentially material impact to investments. Although interestingly, the proportion has been declining, but still in 2017 it was 83%. Even so, less than half of the respondents have developed or plan to develop a procedure for integrating children's rights in their investment decision making. But going back to the slide before, listing the key findings. So we've asked investors what might be behind the non-inclusion of children's rights, and some have commented that it could be due to some kind of a topic fatigue, that various organizations are advocating for their specific issues to be taken into account by business and investors, with this then resulting in a never-ending list of topics to address. As you all know, even within human rights alone, there are so many things, from gender to indigenous people and from garment workers to trafficking. So even if children's rights are seen as material, there are other issues competing for investors' attention that are often seen as possibly even more pressing. As I said, child labour is the exception, and that does come up in the survey responses a lot. And one reason for this could be that it is more or less the only specific child-related issue that's mentioned in international guidelines, which many investors base their responsible investment policy on. And a notable exception is a commentary in the OECD guidelines, where there is a bit more elaboration on the child, still in the connection to child labour, but talking about the role of business in contributing to addressing the root causes of child labour, and in that context, the importance of raising the standards of education. But otherwise, there isn't much help in the international guidelines. I should note that we have also heard from investors that do address children's rights and not just child labour. And with those ones, there is an obvious understanding of the interdependence between different challenges, and they seem to have quite advanced holistic awareness of different risks and opportunities. So instead of considering children's rights just another topic to add to the list, there is great potential in seeing it as kind of a connector linking to many other matters. And one of the respondents commented that when you start making the links between issues and children, you can't stop. Everything has a connection to children in some way. And I'm pretty sure that we will hear from our later speakers today how links can be made between children and various other business relevant ESG issues. Related to this, many investors in our studies emphasize that sustainable development goals are useful since they provide a common language and a clear framework. And that's definitely something that we at GS also hear from our clients. There's lots of interest among investors to understand what do SDGs mean for them and what they should and could do to contribute. So this, I would say, provides another very persuasive argument for investors to explicitly include children's rights when developing an SDG strategy or thinking how to have a positive impact in line with the framework. Finally, I should say that the response rates to our surveys have been very low, which in itself is maybe quite telling and indicates that this either isn't a topic that that interests many investors, or something that they feel that they have much to say about, or possibly both. And I believe that Tracey has also recently had similar experiences, which she will talk about later. Having said that, it's so great to see so much interest in this webinar, and I'm hoping that it's a sign that the trend is really turning. If you just go forward by 2 slides, so skipping to my last one, where you can just see the link to the investor survey report and also the current investor guidelines and my contact details if you want to follow up. But without any further ado, I will now hand over to the experts that you have actually signed on to hear from. So for my part, I would just, before that, perhaps throw them a bit of a challenge to address the issues that I've mentioned here, which our surveys have indicated problematic for investors. So things like financial materiality, topic fatigue, and why or how to go beyond child labour. So hoping to hear comments on those. But with that, we will start with Ida Hyllested from UNICEF. Please go ahead, Ida.
Thank you so much, Tytti, and hello, everyone. And thanks very much to Paloma and to the Investor Alliance for putting together this webinar. I think this is a really great opportunity to spotlight the interlinkages between child rights and business and the role of both investors and individual companies in ensuring the corporate respect for human rights and children's rights specifically. So today I'm going to share some experiences from UNICEF in building the evidence on the different ways that children are impacted by business beyond child labor, and also to raise awareness of our work to raise awareness of and develop guidance to companies to address both their child rights risks and opportunities. And from UNICEF's perspective, we really see that there is room for improvement in both the knowledge and actions of most business stakeholders with regard to how their policies and practices impact children and how they can identify, address, and manage and mitigate these impacts. So next slide, please. So let me just first give you some background information on UNICEF, as well as our engagement with the wider business and human rights agenda and how children fit into this. So many of you may know that UNICEF's global mandate is to support the promotion of children's rights worldwide. And we work in 190 countries and territories to protect the rights of every child. And we have spent more than 70 years working to improve the lives of children and their families. So historically, UNICEF has been mandated to work with governments to enhance public services for children and working closely with civil society organizations. But now in this day and age, we see that our work involves taking on a lot of new challenges, be it the refugee and migrant crisis or climate change related events, which are posing serious new risks to children. And another issue that we have intensified our work on is in relation to the power and responsibilities of business. And so while we've been working with the private sector for a long time, it is a relatively new area for us to work with business around their core business practices and how we can work towards improved standards and business conduct in relation to both environmental and social performance through the recognition of children as critical stakeholders. But let me tell you more about our work on child rights in the context of business. So on the next slide, basically in 2012, and against the backdrop of the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights, UNICEF, together with Save the Children and Global Compact, we developed a set of principles to guide companies on the full range of actions that they can take in both the workplace, in the marketplace, and in the community to respect and support children's rights. And so these are known as the Children's Rights and Business Principles. And the starting point for both the principles and for UNICEF's work is that children are rights holders as well as relevant stakeholders for business, as companies interact with them on a daily basis as workers, consumers, or community members. But despite this, children have not adequately been considered by business to date. And the incorporation of children's rights into corporate due diligence processes is really limited and very often focused just on child labor or in relation to philanthropy. But in terms of the impacts on business and children, these extend beyond this to issues such as product design, to marketing practices, to the behavior of staff or subcontractors towards children. There's also community impacts, and then there's the impacts on children of workplace policies that doesn't take or doesn't safeguard maternity rights or consider childcare provisions, or the promotion of, for example, breastfeeding practices for new mothers in the workplace. And all of these impacts are multiplied across the supply and value chain. But also children represent a powerful stakeholder group for business. They are consumers, influencers, and future employees. They are decision makers and representatives of the communities. So let's look into some of these impact areas in a little bit more detail on the next slide, if it's possible to go to that slide. So the Children's Rights and Business Principles articulate the business impact on children's rights beyond child labor by looking at actions in the workplace, marketplace, and community, as already mentioned. But let me just hone in on a few impact areas, and specifically in relation to digital marketing, to workplace issues, and thematic issues such as security. So marketing and advertising are a basic feature of almost all business and have a huge impact on children for both better and worse. So from stimulating positive behavior change to reinforcing disempowering stereotypes, marketing and advertising can support or impede health, nutrition, and overall well-being of children. And today's children occupy a unique position in the marketing ecosystem. They're an extraordinarily powerful consumer group. They're equipped by technology to exercise commercial influence, but also wielding persuasive influence over their parents' buying choices. And although they have become progressively impervious to traditional forms of advertising, their distrust does not extend to the familiar online space. And a recent Ofcom study, for example, found that an increasing percentage of children aged 12 to 5 turn to Google for true and accurate information, but only a minority can correct correctly identify camouflage forms of marketing. So as advertising has become social, networked, and omnidirectional, children have been cast simultaneously as valuable targets, profitable influences, or as legal liabilities and potential reputational disasters. And so this digital marketing ecosystem operates by collecting data on children. And so one of the key things that UNICEF, or why we're engaging in this debate as well, is how we can ensure that children can go online without their data being used for commercial purposes, and also to ensure that children are considered as everyone under the age of 18, whereas most companies, in terms of their marketing policies, have set the threshold at 12. Looking also at the workplace and to broaden the agenda beyond the child labor focus, which of course remains a hugely critical issue, and which I believe Joe will speak more to. But we also see that there are many other impact areas in the workplace. For example, and drawing on our work and working on the ready-made garment and footwear sector, we see that as many as 250 million children are likely to be affected by the garment and footwear sector as workers, or as children of working parents, or as community members living near the factories. And while child labor is one of the most recognized concerns, there are so many other ways in which the rights of children are impacted. This is particularly evident along the garment and footwear supply chain in relation to substandard working and living conditions for workers and their families, which is often a norm. And we see weak maternity protections for a predominantly female workforce, which means absence of childcare, absence of breastfeeding support, poor maternal health and nutrition, as well as inadequate living conditions and lack of access to basic services, which is the reality for millions of workers of their families. And importantly, the impacts in the workplace and the communities are often interlinked. For example, as presented by the Better Work Initiative, higher wages can positively affect the health status and education opportunities for workers' children. And conversely, improved living conditions, such as through water, sanitation, hygiene standards in communities, can also improve worker health in the factories and reduce occupational health and safety risk. So it's really important to consider child rights in this holistic way that include the efforts to both address working and living conditions. And finally, just to flag issues in the community and honing in on security issues. And we know there are so many specific vulnerabilities of children and youth in security context. And often the main interactions between security services and children happen in cases of protest, community protest, trespassing, theft, vandalism, artisanal mining, or as part of sexual exploitation and abuse. And it is because of their young age, and their physical weakness and inability to read warning signs or follow warning signs that children are at greater risk in these situations and may experience abuse, intimidation, and harassment. And so it's really crucial for a company to have security arrangements in place and security management plans in place that take children's rights into account. So moving on to the next slide in terms of, going into more detail about what standards and norms are in place and what guidance, and that will follow shortly. So while human rights apply to all age groups and children have the same fundamental human rights as adults, there are specific rights that apply specifically to children because of their particular needs and vulnerabilities. And this is just so important to remember. And these rights are enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which spells out every child's right to survival, to develop the fullest, to protection from harmful influences, abuse and exploitation, but also their right to participate fully in family, cultural, and social life. And the Convention also elaborates on the human rights of children, recognizing their interdependence of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. So the guiding principles in business and human rights represent such a hugely important milestone in the business and human rights discussion. But yet, with regard to children's rights, as is referenced to Tytti as well, we see that there is an absence of reference to children's rights in many of these international norms or guidelines or soft law documents. And so this is why we developed specifically the children's rights and business principles in order to address this gap in terms of with regards to children's rights. But turning to the next slide, I just want to show you the linkages between the children's rights and business principles and international standards and norm. So importantly, the children's rights and business principles, which you can see on your right side, they do not create new obligations for businesses. Instead, they build on the internationally recognized standards and provide an operative framework for companies to respect children's existing rights as they're established in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also in ILO Conventions 138 on minimum age and 182 on the worst forms of child labor. And they also put forward the idea that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights as provided in the UN Guiding Principles and in the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact. So really, in many ways, the way we kind of talk about the children's rights and business principles in the context of the UN Guiding Principles is that they really provide a child rights lens to this global standard that has now been established by the Guiding Principles. I also wanted to just highlight that on this chart, you will see a reference to CRC General Comment 16, which is the legal interpretation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in relation to business activities specifically. And this comment spells out the role of governments in supporting children's rights in the context of business activities by providing them with guidance on how to regulate, influence, and engage with the private sector in relation to the respect of children's rights. So that's an important document as well in this whole line. But moving on swiftly to the next slide. So since the launch of the Children's Rights and Business Principles, UNICEF have been working across different themes and industries to generate expertise and evidence of impacts on children by business activities. And we have developed a wealth of resources and guidance tools for companies, but also for governments and other business stakeholders on how to develop and implement policies and practices that consider children's rights. And here on this slide, you will see our 4 key generic guidance documents, which builds on the due diligence frameworks outlined in the UN Guiding Principles, and which includes children's rights and policies and code of conduct, children's rights and impact assessments, children's rights and sustainability reporting, and underpinning all of these due diligence steps is a tool on engaging stakeholders on children's rights. And let me talk a little bit more about the stakeholder engagement tool, also because that is a tool that's has gained a lot of attention and traction from companies. And so for most companies, the consideration of children as a key stakeholder group or understanding how they're impacted by business operation doesn't necessarily require consulting with children directly, but rather the clarity or the understanding of child rights impacts can often be obtained from adults or advocates who have close contact with children or expertise on children's rights. And of course, UNICEF's position is that companies should first consider engaging with child rights advocates who can provide the information in assessing a situation of children's rights in a particular context, and only in limited circumstances would companies need to consult with children directly. And the reason for this is that direct consultation with children can also do more harm than good if it's not carried out appropriately or ethically. So key considerations for consulting children directly include when children can provide information that cannot be accessed through their advocates, or when children's direct voices will provide additional information, evidence, and when adult comments needs to be validated. But all of this all of the guidance of this is provided in this tool, so I recommend you that you have a look at this. So in addition to these generic set of tools, which are useful but are maybe to some extent too generic, actually, UNICEF realized that we needed to deep dive into some specific industry areas to develop guidance that was better tailored for specific industries and for specific thematic issues. So we have developed specific guidance for both the ICT industry, the extractive sector, for the travel and tourism sector, and as well for the ready-made garment and footwear sector, and for food and marketing companies as well. And all of these tools can be found online. But let me just focus on one set of tools for one specific industry sector, so which is the ICT sector. So on the next slide, you will see this range of tools and discussion papers that we have developed. And so this all builds on the fact that not only is digital technology changing the world, but it's also changing childhood, and it is now almost impossible to envisage a complete child protection systems in many countries without the digital world being part of the equation, both as a source of risk to children's rights, offline and online, and as an important component in finding solutions. And so UNICEF's area work builds on evidence and knowledge and tools to ensure that children are safe from online violence and harm, but also empowered to exercise their rights and benefit from all the opportunities that the internet offers. So our mission under this line of work is really to encourage companies to change their business policies and practices so that children have opportunities to become engaged digital citizens, but at the same time as while they're protected from exploitation and harm in relation to development and usage of ICT products and services. And so as part of this, we are working with ICT companies to integrate comprehensive analysis of child rights impacts across the workplace, marketplace, and community. And take action on their findings. And also working with companies that provide internet services and associated technologies to take measures to keep children safe online while respecting their rights to participation and access. And so our area of work include prevention on child online sexual abuse, creating an internet that's safe for children, safeguarding online privacy and free expression, promoting responsible digital advertising, promoting effective digital literacy, and promoting civic engagement and online participation. And so here you have a snapshot of all of the industry tools that we have developed in relation to children and the digital world. And the overarching guide is on the very left is the Child Online Protection Guideline that was developed together with ITU and provides a framework for how companies can work to ensure children's safety when using the internet or any associated technologies or devices. And in addition, we also have the UNICEF Mobile Operator Child Rights Self-Assessment Tool, which provide guidance for mobile operators on assessing their policies and processes as they relate to the workplace, marketplace, and community, and which allows companies to review specific child rights considerations by functional areas. Similarly, we have the Child Online Safety Assessment Tool, which provides guidance for any company that provides or makes use of internet and associated technologies to assess how children's rights in a digital world are considered in their policies and processes. And at last but not least, we have the Notice and Takedown Guide, which we developed together with GSMA to provide guidance to companies in establishing policies and practices to remove online child sexual abuse material. At the far right, you will also see the links to our discussion paper series, which explores the relationship between children's rights, business, and the internet in greater detail. And so these are specifically in relation to issues such as privacy, freedom of expression, access to information, participation, digital literacy, digital marketing. And we're really hoping, and these are of course are not exhaustive in any way, but it's hoped that these paper series can contribute to broadening the conversation on children's rights and business in a digital world. So I'm almost finished, just wanted to add one more. So on the next slide, you will see, I was asked to provide a company example of what does this look like in practice when a company commits to the children's rights and business principles and start looking at their policies and practices with the child rights lens. So the LEGO Group is such an example. We've been partnering since 2015 on the implementation under the overall headline of the implementation of the children's rights and business principles, and with a specific focus on child safety, both online and offline. And LEGO has taken a strong leadership role in promoting children's rights in business, because they want to inspire other companies to also join them on this journey. And some of the concrete actions and outputs from this leadership role is that they, together with us, then co-created the Child Online Safety Assessment Tool that I referenced before, which guides companies to assess and impact their online services in relation to children's rights. And they've also developed a specific action plan on the implementation of their child online safety policy and training program. They've launched a family and parent safety information hub and improved their communication to under 13-year-olds in relation to safety data, privacy issues, and also, for example, integrating safety messages into their games. So we're also working with them together in China as part of building business capacity on child online safety and on the government accountability on child online safety. And another piece of work, which you will see is the second photo there, is in our work together to develop a child safeguarding toolkit for business, which guides companies through 6 steps in developing a child safeguarding program and outlines procedures for setting up a child safeguarding policy, including rolling out an implementation plan and addressing and reporting potential allegations of inappropriate behavior towards children. So quite a comprehensive partnership and looking at many different impact areas on children, but specifically on child safety, offline, online. So to my final slide, just to say that our engagement with the finance industry is relatively new for us and only something we've started this year as UNICEF, but we're really keen to work with financial institutions to develop something or to develop a document that can express what the institution expects from an investee in relation to children's rights, and building on both the UN guiding principles and the CRBPs, and have financial institutions develop such document and make them public and share them with their boards and management teams, and building on this and linked to this, of course, is what Tytti already referenced, which is our joint collaboration to develop a revised set of investor guidance for child rights integration, building on what GS already published a few years ago. And the objectives of this document is really to provide the case for considering child rights in investor decisions and provide guidance on how investors can integrate child rights into their investment strategy, including their interaction with investee companies, and then provide a set of questions that can guide investors in their interaction with a company on what their approach is to addressing impacts on children. And the document highlights specific child rights risk areas, and it also includes annexes with details on the children's rights and business principles and specific child rights indicators relevant across these risk areas. And finally, and just to mention that this piece, Tytti and I are planning to send that out for a public consultation during the week of the 22nd of October. So we plan to share that with all of you also. Finally, just a quick reference to this child footprint tool that UNICEF is also in the process of scoping out, which is the focus of this is to look at both the adverse impact that a business may have on children, so the respect issue, as well as the positive contribution a business may have towards children's well-being and development, so more of the support issue. And so this tool, the purpose of this tool is to measure a company's performance, both positive and negative, in relation to children's well-being. It's really at very initial steps, but it would allow investors to, hopefully allow investors to make better informed decisions and become an instrument for internal company dialogue and interaction on how the company is influencing or impacting children. This is all for me. I hope my presentation has given you a sense of the different issues that impact children beyond child labor, or at least just a snapshot of it. And if you look at the next slide, just these are my contact details, and this is the website where you can find more information about all of these tools and guidance. And this was only just a fraction of it, so that I presented on. So there's much more to learn and much more guidance out there. So please visit our website and don't hesitate to be in touch for any more information.
Great, thank you very much, Ida. That was super interesting. And remember, everyone on the line, if there is something that you'd like Ida to elaborate on, or you're curious to hear more about any of the things that she outlined, please use the chat box, and she will be answering your questions later. And also just to echo what Ida said in terms of the investor guidance, that when we send it out to consultation in a couple of weeks, it'd be great if you had a chance to take a moment to have a look and give us feedback on how we can make it even more useful and practical for you, because we really are aiming for this to be a hands-on document, which will be making it easier to integrate children's rights in your investment policy. So we look forward to your feedback. On that, let's turn to our next speaker, who is Joe Becker from the Human Rights Watch. So please take it away, Joe.
Thanks, Tytti, and hello to everyone. I also want to thank Paloma and the Investors Alliance for Human Rights for organizing the webinar today, and I'm really enjoying the discussion. For anyone who's not familiar with Human Rights Watch, we are a research and advocacy organization that covers human rights issues in about 90 countries worldwide. We investigate human rights abuses, we work to expose and bring them to light, and then we conduct advocacy with policy and decision makers to try and bring about change. Both Tytti and Ida have already pointed out that child labor is probably the issue that is most recognized among businesses in the child rights field. But from Human Rights Watch's perspective, we still see a long way to go in this arena. And in terms of impact, there are still 152 million children engaged in child labor worldwide. And a new Department of Labor report that came out just a couple of weeks ago found that there are as many as 148 individual goods from over 70 countries that are produced with child labor. Human Rights Watch has worked on child labor for nearly 25 years. We've focused primarily on child labor in agriculture, the exploitation of young girls as domestic workers, and child labor in gold mining. Some examples of our work have focused on cotton production in Egypt and Uzbekistan, banana plantations in Ecuador, sugarcane in El Salvador, silk in India, and child labor in US agriculture. In the last 5 years in particular, we've focused increasingly on company practices, specifically in the tobacco and the jewelry industries. So that's what I'm going to present about today, sort of our experiences engaging and campaigning in both sectors. I'll start with tobacco, and we can move to the next slide. Since 2014, we've conducted research on child labor and tobacco farming in the United States, in Brazil, Indonesia, and in Zimbabwe. We've interviewed hundreds of children about their experiences working in tobacco fields. This girl that you see here is working in the United States, which produces, is the 4th largest producer of tobacco in the world. What we found was children working at very young ages, for very long hours, at low wages, and in hot temperatures. A large concern is exposure to pesticides and nicotine. Let's see the next slide. When workers handle the green tobacco leaves, they easily absorb nicotine through their skin. And for children, they can easily absorb as much nicotine as if they were an active smoker. Most of the children we interviewed actually had symptoms of acute nicotine poisoning, including nausea, vomiting, headaches, and dizziness. In the United States, child labor laws do not apply to agriculture, and so it's perfectly legal for children as young as 12 years old to work for 50 or 60 hours a week in the fields. There are no special regulations or protections for children working in tobacco. Next slide. Before we went public with our findings, we reached out to the manufacturers of some of the most popular cigarette brands in the world. We contacted Philip Morris International, Japan Tobacco, R.J. Reynolds, Altria, British American, and other companies. We asked them about their child labor policies and what they did to address child labor in their supply chains. The biggest problem that we found in engaging with companies is that many of them had child labor language in their policies that reflected ILO standards, but they really had no idea what it meant. So for example, they would tell us, well, of course we prohibit hazardous child labor. But then we would ask, well, what do you consider hazardous? And they wouldn't have an answer for us. And if the companies don't know, you can be sure that their suppliers, the tobacco farmers, have no idea of what kind of work is permissible for children and what isn't. Another problem that we found in our engagement was that some companies deferred to national law. And as I mentioned, US law is very weak, much weaker than ILO standards. And as a result, some companies were allowing very young children to work in very hazardous situations. Let's go to the next slide. We had repeated meetings with companies, both before and after we published our findings, and we made detailed recommendations to them about their policies and practices. We got quite a bit of media attention, especially for our work on child labor and tobacco in the United States. And we also engaged members of Congress to write letters to tobacco CEOs and to introduce legislation. The impact, if we turn to the next slide, is that to date, nearly all tobacco companies doing business in the United States have now adopted policies saying that they will not purchase tobacco from farms using children under the age of 16. And that's a huge change because before that, many of them were referring to national law, which, as I said, allows children as young as 12 to work. We've also found that most companies have now adopted much more specific policies outlining what specific tasks in tobacco farming is considered hazardous. So instead of just saying no hazardous child labor, they will specify, no harvesting, no contact with green tobacco leaves, no chopping, etc. And then finally, Philip Morris International has begun a pilot project in the United States to provide alternative activities and income for young people who had been engaged in the tobacco harvest. And we're hoping that it will be expanded to include support from other companies as well. Now I want to switch to the jewelry industry. So the jewelry industry generates about $300 billion a year in revenue. It also uses half of the world's mined gold. But gold is often mined with child labor. In fact, the Department of Labor finds that 21 countries worldwide produce gold with child labor. This is more countries than any other product that they track. Mining is one of the most dangerous sectors for child labor. The ILO estimates that there are as many as 1 million children who are engaged in mining. Let's go to the next slide. Children will climb into unstable shafts, which may collapse. They often carry and crush heavy loads of ore, breathing in the dust. One boy that I interviewed in Ghana said that he'd been spitting up blood for weeks after working in the mines from breathing in the dust. Next slide. And of great concern is that many child miners often handle mercury to process the gold. We found them handling it with their bare hands with no understanding that it is extremely toxic. It can cause permanent brain damage and other neurological disorders. Human Rights Watch has conducted in-depth investigations on child labor and gold mining in Ghana, Tanzania, Mali, and the Philippines. We have engaged with governments in those countries about both strengthening and enforcing their child labor laws. But last year we decided we would also begin engaging with the jewelry sector and the companies that are buying the gold. We initiated contact with 13 of the world's largest and best known jewelry and watchmakers. Next slide. We asked them about their policies and their due diligence regarding child labor and other human rights risks in their supply chains. Collectively, the 13 companies that we contacted, which include Bulgari, Chopard, Pandora, Tiffany, Cartier, and others, account for about 10% of the world's jewelry revenue. We began a process of engagement, including letters and face-to-face meetings, to talk about their due diligence on child labor and other human rights risks in their supply chain. In these conversations, we identified a number of real challenges. One is that we found that some companies have no human rights policies or codes of conduct for their suppliers, or that they don't make them public. We found that for jewelers, many of them took measures to address the issue of conflict gold coming from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. But they really were not focusing on child labor or other human rights risks. We found that most companies could not identify the source of their gold or the conditions under which it was produced, and that many of the companies were too quick to accept the assurances of their suppliers that their gold was clean without real verification. And then finally, some companies didn't audit their supply chains or provide information publicly about their due diligence. Next slide. Based on the information that the companies provided to us and the information that they make available publicly, we rated the companies on 7 key criteria for responsible sourcing. As you can see, the companies got a range of ratings. We found that no company fit in the excellent category, or we would say fulfills all of the criteria for responsible sourcing. We put Tiffany in the strong category. They stand out, for example, in that they can trace all of their gold to its original source. A number of companies were in the moderate category, and then others in weak, very weak. And several companies provided so little or no information that we were unable to rank them. Some of the other good practices that we found, Pandora and Christ, for example, use primarily recycled gold as a way of minimizing the human rights risks from newly mined gold. And all of the companies in the strong and the moderate categories make their supplier code of conducts public. So as part of our engagement, we not only talked with the companies directly, but we also launched a digital campaign with the hashtag Behind the Bling and engaged the media, jewelry trade magazines and publications, and the public in reaching out to the companies. Before we shared information with all of the companies ahead of time, along with our key recommendations. And even before we launched our campaign, 2 of the companies, Boodles and Christ, pledged to make changes, including strengthening their policies and their due diligence and making their information public. And after the campaign was launched, several other companies have begun to review their policies and their practices. We want to make sure that this isn't a one-off campaign, and we will continue to engage. In fact, we're meeting with a couple of companies over the next few weeks, and next year we plan a follow-up report with an updated ranking to give companies an opportunity to show improvement in terms of their policies and their practices. Let's go to the next slide. So just to conclude, we've been really pleased to partner with the Investor Alliance on Human Rights on this issue. And as Paloma mentioned at the beginning, last month, 64 members of the Alliance joined together in a letter that was sent to 32 companies. This was a broader group than the 13 that we originally targeted, but it's an important signal to the industry that all companies need to pay more attention to these issues of due diligence around child labor and other human rights risks. So we're hoping that other investors will continue to raise these concerns with companies and stress the importance of robust due diligence. Last slide. So thanks very much. I'll be happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Jo. So good to hear about your efforts and the impacts that you're having on this issue that, as you said, just isn't going away, even if there is a little bit more attention to this. So really, really interesting stuff. So now I will hand over to Tracey Rembert from CBIS to take us over the finishing line and lead the discussion. So please go ahead, Tracey.
Thank you so much, Tytti. Hi, everyone. This is Tracey Rembert from Christian Brothers Investment Services. Just a few words about CBIS. We were formed in 1981, and we specialize in incorporating Catholic responsible investing and Catholic social teaching into our investment process. And we do that through engagement, screening, proxy voting, policy work, and a lot of investor education. And I have 18 years of experience in responsible investment across a number of issues, but children's rights has really been a pretty new one for me, even in the scope of general labor rights and human rights work in the past. We CBIS invests on behalf of Catholic institutions worldwide and found that human trafficking and child exploitation were top concerns for our investors. And we have a history of working within the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility on various aspects of children's rights, but this really came to kind of a forefront of connection to our human trafficking and sex trafficking work, which I'll go into in a minute. I just wanted to mention that, we've talked about how do you think about children's issues, children's impacts beyond child labor, and just within ICCR, that coalition of investors has worked on everything from engagement with Nestle on infant formula in the 70s and 80s and beyond, to child labor, to tobacco marketing to children, to violent video games and having standards for inappropriate content, to toxins, to audits of supply chains, to nutrition and junk food marketing, and a number of other issues. So when you actually think back on engagements or issues that have been brought to you as a company or brought to you as an investor, if you do think back, you'll realize some of the connections to children's impacts and children's rights, I think, as part of that history of engagement. We started about a year and a half ago on looking at child sexual exploitation online, and particularly in the ICT sector. Some of that came out of our sex trafficking work historically, but we had also engaged with telecom companies on pornography and inappropriate content for children. And I think it kind of made a natural segue too, to look at the impacts to children using devices and platforms and services in how they were being groomed, exploited, coerced, sometimes to generate content themselves of a sexual nature, and just how prevalent this was across a number of different technologies. So the slide up on the screen just summarizes some of the engagement goals that we have in terms of both, educating investors, working with child protection advocates, and bringing these issues to companies to raise the bar on best practice in protecting children. And one thing that we found in this work is sometimes, and I think this is probably the case for many children's rights issues, you have to start having a conversation of balancing different rights. So even within the domain of children, when we bring these issues to companies, you might be balancing, the obligation to protect children from sexual abuse and harm, to also protecting their right for freedom of expression and lack of censorship for children and access to information and community building. And sometimes those are hard rights and responsibilities to balance. Other times you might be considering children's rights, and for us, protecting children from sexual harm online, with other rights of users, like the right to privacy of adult users. So sometimes these issues can become more complicated within a company. I'll just say that in the initiative itself to protect children in the ICT sector, we really wanted to improve disclosure, get companies to commit to more actions and policies to identify sexually exploitative behaviors online, and then, to commit to blocking and taking down child sex abuse imagery, something that UNICEF has worked on and produced guides on, to advocating users on trends and risk and behaviors that put children at risk, and then how innovation plays a role in both protecting children online from grooming and, child pornography and abuse, to also empowering children to understand risks and or creating new tools that empower children that also curb the harms that we were seeking to cut. So the initiative overall raised a number of challenges for us, and some of them have been referred to by Tytti. One was few investors that we talked to kind of understood the link between the ICT sector and child sexual exploitation. So there was a lot of education the first year that we rolled out this work, just in making those links and connections for both companies and for investors. Second was few investors globally really had a focus on children's human rights. So we went to actually form an investor and child protection advisory committee to draft expectations for the sector on protecting children from sexual exploitation. It was hard to find investors that really had an understanding of or experience in children's human rights, and very specifically that had kind of that technology sector component or experience and the children's rights expertise. Norgis and GES are, a few exceptions to that rule. And when we raised the issue with some companies, they often wanted to spend a lot of the time talking about child labor and what they'd done to clean up their supply chain. So where they have done some good work on children's rights issues and children's impacts, they wanted to have the whole conversation move to there and not to the issue that we were bringing to them, which was great to hear the work that they had put into place for several years. But then it was frustrating too that they could not pivot in some ways, or did not want to pivot to the issue that we're bringing to them. And then very few companies in high-risk sectors like the ICT sector too had identified children's human rights abuses as material or a high priority issue in a materiality matrix, regarding ESG processes. The other was, even when companies were doing something in this space on child protection online, very few wanted to talk about, disclose in any way policies or actions related to the issue. So that points to the sensitivity, I think, of companies, brands, and their reputation being linked to infringing on children's rights, or children, being linked to abuses or harms to children. But that also, I think, shows that companies do have brand and reputation sensitivity to infringing on children's human rights. So perhaps we will see greater improvements and, you know, connections moving forward, I think, in company understanding and the evolution of, you know, connecting existing issues with how they might be impacting a certain subset of rights holders or stakeholders. But it's also, I think, there's some optimism to be had too in terms of how you can raise issues with companies and how companies can educate people internally within the corporation and tackle some of these issues by making connections to some existing work. You know, for us, the issue of child sexual exploitation online could be easily linked to some of the human trafficking and sex trafficking work that we had done in the past. And sometimes that could be brought up to a company in that context. You know, the challenges, I think, will not be solved anytime soon, but a webinar like this, we hope will kind of raise connections in terms of viewing impacts to children through the lens of a child. So, you know, in the ICT sector, can the company put you know, can the company view its products and services through that lens of a child and seeing a different perspective in terms of how its business model might be impacting a subset of both users, customers, influencers, and rights holders? And the other that I think Tytti mentioned is, you know, sometimes it is hard for both companies and investors to see the financial materiality case for a company's practices or products or services infringing on basic human rights of children until all of a sudden it is material. So for instance, you know, you're a company that doesn't see this as financially material, but all of a sudden you're linked to child labor, like Kathy Gifford, or child sex abuse like Backpage, and then it becomes highly relevant and highly financially material. So you know, I think I would definitely encourage investors and companies to become familiar with some of the materials that UNICEF and Human Rights Watch and GES have put out in terms of how do you look at a human rights risk assessment through a child's rights lens, for instance. How do you start just looking at basic products and services and core parts of your business model and how they're impacting children and how you report that out and how you're kind of road testing that over time. And I think there's going to be tremendous opportunity in the rollout of the Sustainable Development Goals, many of which have some connection to children's rights and business. There's going to be opportunity for impact investors and I think companies in sharing their stories of how they have started to address this issue. So with that, just go to the next slide if you could. These are just some easy ways, I think, that investors can start thinking about how to incorporate children's rights. One is, you know, we ourselves have a working group that is now starting to have monthly calls and to push out information just on the child exploitation online piece. That's a very specific component of this conversation today. And then when we have an expectations document coming out next year, investors and or companies can endorse that document. But more broadly, I think there's the issue of, like, how are you voting? Do your proxy voting guidelines and or your voting record, you know, weighing in to kind of support the protection of children's rights in resolutions that might come up? Or if you're assessing sovereign debt, are you assessing at the country level that country's protection, you know, legal regimes for protecting children's rights or cleaning up specific types of abuses that might be targeting children, for instance? So there are a number of different ways that this can play out in the investment sphere. But what I like to do now is kind of turn it both back to the speakers and to the audience for questions. I have not seen any questions yet come in through the queue. But now is the time to ask any of our speakers, you know, how does the rubber hit the road? How does this play out with companies? What, you know, specifically, say, for instance, I can kick off with the first question, and this would be for Ida and also for, you know, possibly Joe and Tytti to weigh in. You know, how would, for instance, an approach be different for a company to include children's rights into a sustainability report? Or how might a company think about incorporating children's rights into an impact assessment versus doing just a standard human rights assessment? Ida,
Sure.
I didn't know if
Happy
you could
to,
take that first.
yeah,
happy to kick it off. I think, thanks for that question. I think there's so many ways that that this can happen, and we have the guidance also to support a company that wants to consider the integration of children's rights into either an existing human rights impact assessment framework or an existing environmental social impact assessment framework. So it's really, there isn't one model that fits all, and the guidance we're providing is really to say that, you know, whatever works for you, but there are ways to not make this a huge standalone child rights impact assessment piece, but really consider how you can integrate specific considerations and criteria into an existing human rights impact assessment methodology, for example. And we have examples of that, both in terms of how it's been done as an integration piece, but also others who have decided to actually do a standalone child rights impact assessment, and what they saw as the value of doing that and the benefits of doing that, in terms of actually exposing a number of risks they didn't realize that they had. So yeah, both of that is that information is available in the generic guidance piece I spoke to earlier, but also there's of course then examples of the specific industry specific impact assessment models where we have specific guidance for mining companies and how to integrate child rights into their impact assessments. We have specific guidance for mobile operators, for internet service providers, and so forth. So all of this is really, and what I just want to emphasize is that this isn't a big new project. It's really about just taking and understanding that this is about integrating this child rights consideration into existing models, and much of this can also be done by ensuring disaggregated, you know, age data, and knowing what the specific groups of vulnerabilities there exist among children, for example, in relation to children living outside households, or children living in residential care institutions, or children in orphanages, or children heading their own households, so to speak. So yeah, I'll stop there on the impact assessment. And also on, just quickly on the sustainability reporting, we do have examples of companies that have chosen to use the children's rights and business principles as a framework for their sustainability reporting to good effect. And then we have this document which provides or basically looks at the indicators in the GRI disclosures that can be used to report on each of the children's rights and business principles. So that's another way of going about it. And again, it's really with a focus on the integration, not a standalone. Thank you.
Does anyone have anything to add to that, or should we move to another topic?
Yeah, I'll make a couple of comments. I think for, you know, companies who really want to take child rights seriously, there are a couple of things that sort of come to mind based on our experience at Human Rights Watch. When we started working with tobacco companies, for example, you know, some said that they had done on-the-ground assessments in their tobacco supplier fields and had not seen child labor. And so we're surprised that we found that it was a big issue. But then when we explored a little bit further, we realized that, you know, they were sending auditors out during times of year when children were not likely to be working, and, you know, we're not necessarily conducting one-on-one interviews with workers. And so part of our recommendations to them was then about, you know, how they need to time those assessments and those audits to be most likely to detect child labor problems. And then, you know, in jewelry, you know, I mentioned earlier that a lot of companies were very attuned to the issue of conflict. And I think this is because, you know, as you mentioned, Tracey, companies do tend to be sensitive when their brand reputation is on the line or if they're criticized in the media. And so in the jewelry industry, there's a strong sensitivity around conflict issues because of the movie Blood Diamonds, because of media exposés around, you know, conflict diamonds, conflict gold. And so many of them had sort of focused their policies and their practices around that issue. And it meant that they had some real blind spots when it came to child labor or other child rights issues. So, you know, I think that to us spoke to the importance of, you know, companies really, you know, taking a broad view when they're looking at impact assessments and making sure that they're identifying the full range of human rights risks that they need to be looking at.
Thanks, Joe. Joe, this might seem like a very obvious question, but we talk as investors about moving beyond child labor into other issues impacting children, but we have not really solved the problem of child labor. Recently there was a letter on Turkmenistan cotton, and you've got cobalt engagements related to child labor and chocolate and other issues. Is this always going to be around? Are we always going to be playing kind of a game of whack-a-mole of identifying child labor in certain industries and certain spots and trying to react to that? Or are there some underlying issues in play that fosters the prevalence of child labor? I mean, is it just extreme poverty, or does it go beyond that in terms of core components of sustainable development, where this is that we need to address that issue too, in order to kind of wipe this phenomenon out?
That's a great question, Tracy. Yeah, it seems like child labor continues to crop up over and over again in different sectors. I think it is important to have a bit of an overview that we have made tremendous progress in the last 20 years. Global child labor rates have gone from about 245 million in the year 2000 to 152 million today. Now, that's obviously 152 million too many, but it's a drop of 1/3, which is pretty substantial. And certainly poverty is key, but what the ILO has found is most effective in reducing child labor rates are two things. One is the availability of quality free education. And as countries have invested in more and better schools and eliminating tuition fees, we've seen a corresponding drop in child labor rates. A second issue is, making sure that there are good laws that are being enforced. And when we see, robust legal systems and enforcement, we also see drops in child labor. And then finally, we've seen a lot of progress in companies that adopt real policies around social protection. For example, really targeting the poorest families with interventions like cash transfers, providing a small stipend as an incentive to keep children in school rather than sending them out into the workplace. In Morocco, for example, one study found that as little as $8 a month per child was enough to make the difference in terms of big changes in school enrollment and drops in child labor. Or even providing, free school meals is often a very effective incentive to get families to send their children to school. And so when companies look at ways to try and, address child labor and to, remedy child labor in the supply chains, supporting these kinds of initiatives by, ensuring that children have access to schooling and, alternative income sources can be very important. So, I guess to sum up, it's still a huge challenge, but at the same time, we've been making a lot of progress and we know some of the key interventions that work.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. We have some questions coming in. So one is from Michelle Lau. I didn't know, Michelle, if you wanted to be unmuted and ask your question, or I can go ahead and ask it for you. I will go ahead and jump in if Michelle has any clarifications. Maybe we can unmute the line and she can piggyback on mine. So she asks, have you seen companies advocate on behalf of children's rights with government authorities, even when these impacts are not linked to the company? In the U.S., I'm thinking of family separation at the border or the possibility of indefinite detention of migrant children if the Flores Agreement is overturned. And that's for any of our speakers.
This is Joe again. This isn't relating to the U.S., and this is a case study that I didn't speak about in my presentation. But in 1994, we did a study of child labor and sugarcane production in El Salvador, and we found that one of the biggest buyers of sugarcane in El Salvador was the Coca-Cola company. And we engaged early on with Coca-Cola, and their initial reaction was quite disappointing. They said that their direct suppliers were not using child labor, therefore it wasn't their problem. And bear in mind that this was long enough ago that the guiding principles on business and human rights had not yet been developed, and there wasn't yet really a consensus that companies had responsibilities not only for their direct suppliers, but also through their supply chain. But even though their initial response was disappointing, Coca-Cola did end up really engaging and working very hard with the El Salvador government and with the sugar industry to make some very strong initiatives to address child labor. And in fact, I don't have the numbers at hand, but over a few years' time, the numbers shifted dramatically and child labor rates dropped by about 90%. And I would say that Coca-Cola's active engagement with the El Salvador government was certainly part of that.
Wow.
And if you want another example, I can add the work of Sansiri in Thailand, which is a great example of a company that as per the question was engaging on an advocacy issue for children, which was in relation to the malnutrition of children in Thailand, and based on evidence that Thai children had lower IQ scores from the World Health Organization because of iodine deficiency. And they basically did a massive advocacy campaign to argue for increased iodine in foods, and it was they lobbied the government, and this was used to change legislation around it, and basically because of this there was then new legislation around iodization, which ensured that the Thai children could see an increase now in the nutrition level. So just another example of where you choose some topic, and this is a serious a real estate construction company, so completely disassociated from the issue, but it can be very powerful when you have a corporate champion engage on a child rights specific issue, and they can make a lasting change.
Thank you. So we have another question, and this is for I think Tytti can kick us off, and then others can join in. So the webinar is a good example of effective collaboration. The Investor Alliance, Human Rights Watch, UNICEF, GES. How can this type of collaboration be extended to future strategies focused on businesses and government?
Yes, thank you, Tracey. I think the key point there is the collaboration with different investors, and investors really getting together and behind the same aim, and kind of singing from the same hymn to make sure that we are not giving any conflicting messages, and really are all behind the same efforts. In terms of government specifically, that's not something that I have particularly experience in. I would say that's actually the one stakeholder. GS as such doesn't focus our engagement that much. It's more towards companies, investors, and collaboration with other stakeholders in the civil society. But yeah, so I would say just underline how it's always worth looking for collaboration opportunities, like the one that Tracey also mentioned. Like it could be a tricky issue, and it could be an issue that companies, and I guess that same goes for the government, might be a challenging one for them to address. But the more they hear about it from different investors and other stakeholders, the more it helps to drive across the point that this is something they should have something to say about, and something that they should be doing about. So I would just really kind of fly the flag for collaboration in general, and taking advantage of the combined leverage that investors and getting together with other stakeholders can have. But if anyone else has specific examples about the engagement with governance authorities, that would be interesting for me as well to hear.
Well, this is Tracey. I can kick off part of that conversation in the topic of child sexual exploitation online. There's a high level of cooperation of governments worldwide on that issue. I think maybe partly it's because there are already legal regimes that say things considered to be child pornography are illegal in most nations, and the internet has kind of exacerbated the profusion of people sending around such material. But it was interesting too, the different types of collaboration we are seeing just on that issue of children's rights, because there's a whole NGO of tech and telecom companies coming together in the technology coalition, where they're all kind of sharing best practice at the corporate level on combating child sexual exploitation. Now, they don't disclose a lot of what happens there, but just the fact that there's a whole initiative where companies get together and share best practice on combating child exploitation online is positive. And then you have nonprofits that feed into that space too, in terms of trying to create some technological solutions or working with companies and or NGOs weighing in with governments on policy. And even in the United States, where it's been very hard to find a lot of collaboration in the last year at the policy level, child exploitation online policy moved with bipartisan support in April in the Senate and House. And, you know, I think there are a number of issues around children where they are very ripe for kind of NGO, business, and government collaboration. And hopefully the SDGs and others might spur that on a little bit more of a global basis and not just a regional basis. I didn't know if others had examples.
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is Jo. You know, just again on the jewelry industry, when we started our engagement, you know, we were engaging primarily as Human Rights Watch, and then once we launched our campaign, we broadened out and included quite a number of NGOs in a joint statement from almost 30 different groups addressing the industry and challenging them to adopt more responsible sourcing policies and practices. But, you know, we really valued the collaboration with the Investor Alliance and the letter that the Alliance issued last month to 32 companies, because it really sends a different kind of message that it's not just NGOs that care about these issues, but that, you know, investors also see this as an important priority that companies need to address. So, you know, we were really excited about that collaboration and hope we can do something more in the future. You know, UNICEF has also been a really important partner to Human Rights Watch over the years, and sometimes we talk with UNICEF and we talk about our respective roles being good cop and bad cop. Sometimes Human Rights Watch is the bad cop pointing fingers at, you know, companies or governments for poor child rights practices, but because they're often on the ground, you know, working with governments on different programs, UNICEF can then come in and say, hey, listen, we can help you address this problem, and here's how we can do it.
We still have time for other questions from the audience. You can use the chat function to raise any questions.
Tracey, if I can add something as well. This is Ida, sorry.
Yes.
So I just wanted to also maybe just highlight, I think it was a great question before in terms of how bringing investor alliances and government together, but also just focusing or honing in on the role of investors and institutional investors and the power and influence they have in terms of convening their investee companies together. And there UNICEF has been working with NBIM, the Norway's bank investment management, since 2017 on a project to focus on some of the impact areas that I mentioned under the footwear and garment sector. And so the NBIM is calling some of their major brands that they're investing in together to discuss and facilitate peer learning among apparel buyers and producers around better business practices for children in the sector. So by creating this space where the brands and producers can come together and talk about some of the challenges they're having through workshops, through webinars, but also through, you know, sharing these dilemmas or challenges, it really can push the envelope, so to speak, in terms of generating new knowledge, but also one of the outcomes of this work is that we are coming up with metrics to allow for measurements of more effective ways of addressing children's rights in supply chain, moving beyond this very strict compliance focus or some of the issues related to the lack of worker voice as well. So it's just that there's a really important role for the investors in tackling these issues, and they don't need to know the answer, but they can start the conversations and they can bring together the relevant companies as well, together with the likes of UNICEF and Human Rights Watch and GES and you know, the Investor Alliance. I mean, there's so many opportunities really for increased stakeholder dialogue and exchange around promising company practices and examples.
One of the attendees to the webinar also raised another example of collaboration that I should have thought of because we have been involved in some of this work, but that was on children's issues related to HIV drugs and having specific drugs formulated for children. And UNICEF, along with several UN agencies, the attendee remarked, and investors and much of the global faith community all work together to address the pharmaceutical industry and making child-friendly formulations for the drugs. And that's yet another example of collaboration. And I think we'll see more of that. What is somewhat surprising to me is there aren't many investment products that I have seen with a specific focus on children. I know Robeco has a children's fund that looks at specific aspects and impacts to children from various sectors. And I know, like I mentioned before, Norges has long played a role in kind of stipulating expectations on protecting children's rights in various ways across their investments. But I think the product innovation space is ripe for some movement here in terms of products that might be focusing on and measuring and assessing company performance on children's rights issues. Do we have other questions? We probably have time for one more good question from the audience. And if not, I'll give a minute for another one to come in. But one thing that I had a question for, just starting on this journey of a whole new topic and trying to figure it out and who the key players are, whether you're an investor or a company, where, for the panelists, where is a good place to start? Say you're a company and an issue has been brought to you where there is a clear impact on children from your products or services or business model. How do you start off the exercise of starting to incorporate and assess how you might be impacting children and how you can remedy that? Do any of our three speakers have some basic wisdom on how do you start down that path?
Well, this is Joe. I think that, the place to start is with, some of the accepted international standards, the guiding principles on business and human rights, in some sectors, OECD guidance, especially around due diligence, and really conducting, the assessments to identify the human rights risks in the supply chain, and, going through the steps of, identifying, remedying, and addressing these issues. So I think that's the place to start.
Okay.
This is Ida here. Yeah, sorry, no, go ahead. I was just going to agree with Joe.
Quickly, Ida, and then we have one more question that came in.
No, I think we just have such an outstanding framework with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and that's the place to start. And there is so much guidance now. There are so many different examples and case studies that can support a company on starting this journey. So it's really, there's so much material out there. And I think that's also what the importance of this webinar is, to highlight and spotlight all the existing material. So it's just to get started.
And this is to just to briefly build on that as well, that if you as an investor or company have an issue, it's quite likely that your peers have had the same issue as well. So unless there's some competitive issues preventing it, speak to the others in the sector and kind of put your heads together and together share the challenges and find solutions to them. There's normally no harm in kind of sharing and working together.
Very, very good advice for a number of these issues. So we do have a question from the Conflict Risk Network, and more likely for Ida and for Joe, but have you seen any traction about some of the not so obvious children's rights related to businesses operating in areas affected by conflict?
Yeah, sorry, this is Ida. So that's a great question. I think one of the things that we realized through our work with the mining sector was that actually the issues in relation to security that I mentioned before was something that there wasn't sufficient visibility or exposure to the fact that children are a very high risk group when it comes to security personnel, and the different issues that I listed before in terms of the different ways that children come into contact with security personnel, and that there are some and so this really gained traction with many mining companies in terms of how simple it would be for them to include child rights into their security protocols, or child rights considerations into their security protocols, their impact assessments, their checklist, and their training modules, because most of them already have existing training material on human rights, but very few had something specific on child rights. So so in relation to the security sector, that's definitely something where we've seen a new interest.
Yeah, the issue of child rights in conflict areas is a good one, and something that's come up is that I think the default response for many companies when abuses in conflict countries emerge is just to stop sourcing from those countries. And in fact, that creates another set of problems, because you have, communities in those countries that are dependent on income, that are, suddenly, losing their, opportunities for to produce. So, there are some companies that are really trying to do a thoughtful job of figuring out how can they source responsibly from conflict countries, so that they can, source gold or whatever, the products are, without generating revenue for abusive rebel groups, for example, but still maintaining the right of local communities to have livelihoods. And like Signet, for example, is the largest diamond retailer in the world, and they're thinking very seriously about this, how they can source responsibly from conflict countries. And I think it's a very important thing to pay attention to.
Thank you. And Paloma, can you go ahead and close the session off for us and our attendees?
Certainly. Thank you, Tracey, for that. I want to thank, I want to thank you, as well as all of our wonderful speakers, for sharing your truly wonderful expertise and insights with us. I think this has been a very rich discussion, and it gives us a lot of not just food for thought, but tools and guidance to really take this work ahead, both as an alliance as well as individual investors. I just want to recall that we will be sharing all of this information after the call, including the webinar, as well as some of the key guidance and tools mentioned. Just before jumping off of the call, I do want to invite those investors who are on the line who may not be members of the Alliance to join the Investor Alliance, as well as to invite other stakeholders on the line to engage with us, the same way that Human Rights Watch and UNICEF have been engaging with us, really with the goal of collaborating on these and other important human rights topics moving forward. Should you need further information on the Alliance, or just want to get in contact with me to discuss opportunities further, please contact me at the address below. So with that, I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us, and I wish you a great weekend ahead. Goodbye, everyone.